So welcome to the MVC MVVM Architecture and Communication Workshop. So this is all about separating the concerns in different applications with design patterns. So firstly, let's take a look at the content. So we're going to be talking about what is MVC MVVM architecture, why is this important at all, and how do front-end communicate with backend in terms of this architecture. And then we're going to have a little bit of a demo given we have React and also integrating it with Django. Okay? So firstly, what is the MVC or MVVM architecture? For the people that has gone through the workshop for Django, you would be able to see this in some extent. So model represents, it's the data representation layer. It's basically how an application communicates to a database. It can either be by raw communication or with an object relational model. You have view, which is an interface representation. It can be an HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. And for controller, it's just a request relay, which just basically processes an HTTP relays. And this is what it technically looks like. So if you have a user and they're interacting with the browser interacts with basically a routing of a URL for an API endpoint. This routes it to the specific controller that we have. The controller may be something like it's processing a GET request, and that maps to a GET thing in the model. It's like a read operation towards a database, and then from there you could have a controller that actually processes it using maybe a renderer to basically turn that data from a database into a HTML or CSS JavaScript page. And then it goes back to this one. The controller serves the HTTP request with the relevant information going back to the browser. We're going to be taking a look at the technical details later on. So the next one is the MVVM architecture. MVVM stands for the view model. So this is the VM right here. And it's basically a data binding relay, similar to a view, but it's kind of like, instead of having a controller right there, you just have something right here that basically integrates the backend and the front end directly. And this is kind of what it looks like. You have your view. Whenever you have interaction from the user, it basically does some sort of HTTP request relay over right here. There's some information that's getting passed around with the model. Maybe it updates it, or maybe it gets new information, and then it'll update the interface. Okay? I just want to acknowledge that there are some inaccuracy here because of the fact that if you search MVC and MVVM, you're going to see a lot of conflicting details. But a portion of this slide is actually not about what MVC or MVVM architecture is. It's more about how is this useful to be able to understand how front-end and back-end integrates together. Okay? So let's take a look at a little bit of different examples when it comes to actual technology that you can use to form this architecture. So let's go with Django first. So Django is it's a very full solution in terms of a backend, but it can actually also do front-end to some extent. If you're not going to use like a front-end framework, you still have what's called a Django renderer. Currently, it does not really make a lot of sense right here, so I'm going to be using a different example to Django, but let's persist more. Here's an example of a React integration to Django. So you have your React over here. You may have like, let's say, a state management library over here. It basically binds your user interface towards your API endpoint. So this is kind of like, if you're going to use Vue, this is like your Vuex layer. This is Vue, and then it integrates towards the API endpoint. So always, at any given point of time, your interface is synced up with your backend system. Let's take a look at an example with Flask, because of the fact that Django is like very built in. Like you're gonna have like Django ORM, Django render, like everything is Django. So with Flask, it's much more, I guess, minimalistic in its terms of its approach. That's the reason why it's easier to explain how Flask works in terms of its different concerns rather than the Django. So in this case, you could have a Flask backend. It's minimalistic in its nature. You'll be using an SQL alchemy for your object relational model so that your controller can communicate with the database using a model relation. And then, when you fetch data using SQL alchemy with a model, I can process that with Jinja, which is just using a Python-like syntax. You can generate dynamic user interface using just the base HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. Let's take that a little bit further. Now, instead of using Jinja as a renderer, you can use our front-end frameworks, the typical front-end frameworks. You could have React, Redux, and then you have your data binding with Flask and Redux over there, and then your model is now SQL Alchemy. So as you've seen, in terms of the MVVM, I technically replace a portion of the view over here, the interface rendering, into a rendering that happens on the front in the browser, which is the client-side rendering part. We're going to talk about that later, I believe. Let's take a look at another example. So what about now? I don't want to use Flask. I don't want to use Django. I want a full JavaScript solution. Okay? So you can have what's called Node.js, which is a platform on top of. It's a platform for running JavaScript outside of the browser. You can have Express as my library to create my HTTP requests or control relays. So this is what it technically looks like. It's kind of similar, as you would see. So I have Node.js Express processing the HTTP requests. I can choose SQLize to do my SQL ORMs and communications with the database. And then, with this information, I can use what's called embedded JavaScript to actually render my user interface. Does that make sense for everyone? So what I'm basically demonstrating over here is that I can build the exact same architecture or build the same application using different technologies, but each of the different technology pieces correspond to a particular purpose. Does that make sense? So just to go back a little, so model, you have SQLize over here that I'm using right here. But for the Flask, I can use SQL Alchemy with that. For view, Flask uses Jinja, but for just basic Express, you can have embedded JavaScript. Okay? And this is almost a similar one, similar case, MBBM, but now it's Express over here and SQLize over here without the embedded JavaScript. Okay? So now that we've discussed that with a little bit of example, now let's take a look at why is software architecture even important to understand in the first place. So architecture shows how an entire software works in a high level. So as you've seen, you can think about like technology stacks kind of like some Lego pieces. I'm building a little bit of tower, it's a stack, but each different piece corresponds to a particular purpose. Okay? So it's important for firstly, maintainability and extensibility. Let's say, for example, I have an application that used to use this. Maybe I used to use SQL for my database, but I want to transition to maybe a Mongo database solution because I realized that I need a much more flexible schema rather than a fixed straight point. So if I have understanding of software architecture, I can technically say, hey, let's maintain all these things. Let's just change this one. And it'll still work fine, still work the same way. It's also important for, I guess, separation of concerns. Because everything is separated towards each individual parts, you know which individual pieces does what thing. So given another example over here, we know that SQLize corresponds always to the database. Express will always correspond towards your control relays for your HTTP request. And it's also, I guess, the next one is important for choosing different pieces of the stack. Later on, when you go in the software industry, you're going to be working with different stacks, and that might not be something that you've come across before. But because if you have understanding for the entire full stack development, front end, back end, then you're always going to have something to come back to when your team chooses a different solution. Maybe my team, maybe what I'm used to is using Express.js for my backend, but when it comes to an actual enterprise solution, maybe my team is using, I don't know, Django. So I can always refer to documentation that says, maybe because I'm on Express background, I can say, I can search in Google, Express Django equivalents for SQLize or something like that. Alright? So here's just some examples of architectural diagrams, and you're going to see this a lot in the future. So here's an example of a typical Flask backend, but this one uses also Flask for rendering, and it's connected with Keras. Keras is another piece of the stack, I would say. This one is also another example, which is using React, but it doesn't use your usual backend per se. It uses AWS Amplify, so it's kind of like outsourcing the backend development, by basically using built-in AWS stuff and also creating some custom functionalities for your application. This is also another example. This one uses React in the front end, Django for the back end, PostgreSQL for your database, but you have your Django ORM to do communications with the PostgreSQL, and you're going to have other things over here. This is what's called a background worker architecture, right over here. Okay. Now let's talk about using what we know with the software architecture. Now let's talk about how do front end communicates with the back end. So in the previous workshop with Django, and maybe in the React workshop as well, is the fact that you know that we communicate with the backend using different methods, and the backend responds with different ways. You can have HTML, CSS, or JavaScript as your requests that you get from the backend. You can have JSON or XML as its format. Here's an example with the server-side rendering. So when we refer to server-side rendering, this is what it looks like. I have a request coming from a device going to the server. The server actually does a request towards the database, and then using some of those data, it will be basically pre-populate what your, I guess, it will generate what your interface will look like using those data. So it responds with a dynamically generated HTML. Next example is client-side rendering and Ajax. This is what you will encounter a lot in these projects, because we're using front-end frameworks that actually does client-side rendering. So with Vue, React. So with this case, your backend usually responds with a blank HTML with JS at the first start, and then all the data that comes in after that are in the form of JSON or XML. So it kind of looks like this. I have a browser. I create a request towards my backend endpoint. My backend endpoints will basically does some query over towards some other things in the server. It may do some database calls. It may even actually sometimes fetch things related to different components of your server, and then it will just respond to that. Those JSON, I guess, in terms of communication with front end and back end, when it comes to just typical REST APIs, which you will use for usual Ajax requests, it usually follows a pattern. It's called a REST API pattern, and it looks like this. So if I am dealing with a user's resource, I do a GET request on /users, it will retrieve me all the users. If I do a post request on top of these users, I'm basically creating a user. If I'm doing a get request on this particular pattern, ID over here, then it will retrieve one user that has this ID, and so on. So update and delete. So as you can see, it actually matches the CRUD operations of your database, but it also matches the verb, the HTTP verb for the JSON standard communications. Okay, so let's talk about a little about Ajax, just a little. It's called the asynchronous JavaScript and XML, but let's just remove that for now because it's usually at the form of JSON, and it kind of looks like that. So JSONs are something to note. JSONs are string. You have to serialize it to become an object. So you can see key value pair, like that. Okay. So now let's get to a little bit of demo. So this demo is about how do I use React to consume a standard REST API Django to-do application. And the REST API Django to-do app was created in the previous workshop. Okay? So I know that some people here uses Vue and some people on React, but I believe what you get from this workshop is not really about React. It's really mainly about how do I go from a front-end framework, integrate it with a backend that has a usual pattern. Okay? So now let's take a look at this. So this is my Django application, or at least my API endpoint at the moment. So let's take a look at a little bit of its documentation. So taking a look at this, I have my post request here that actually requires a couple of things. It requires a title, it requires a description, and it doesn't require a completed because these ones are automatically generated. Okay, let's create some to do things. So maybe test description or something like that. Kind of looks like that. Okay, let's create another one. Okay, so as you can see over here, when I query the /API/todos, this does a get request on top of this one. This one will do a post request on the same URL. Okay, next ones, I can technically gather the specific details of a particular thing if I get this one, and I can do a delete. I can also do a update or put. Okay, now starting from scratch in terms of the front end, I do an npx create React app. I do Django integration. It's my name of the application. I just do a little bit of installation over there. Okay. Give me a sec. Looks like it doesn't want to install it. Just wait a second. Just gotta remove this. This is strange. Instead of using React, maybe I'll just use Next.js. Oh, that one worked. So now let me just go towards that one. Right over here. It's still building that one. So just wait a second. sec, guys. It's taking longer than expected. Wi-Fi. Okay. So now let's just start that application. I'm just gonna remove a lot of this thing so that it's cleaner. And I'll just do start beyond it. Okay. So currently this is our front end. Let's do a little bit of communications in terms of in the backend. So firstly, let's just say my base URL is equal towards this one, localhost 3000, right over here. And then I can say a couple of things, my API endpoints. Actually, my API endpoint really only had one thing currently, but for the sake of this, let's just do this. And then API slash like that. Okay. Let me just take a look at that if this is correct. So localhost 3000. Actually, it's not localhost 3000. It should be localhost. Not that. Sorry. Oh, it is localhost 8000. Hang on a sec. Let me just I just have some running services at the background that shouldn't be running. So this should be localhost 8000. Okay, and then slash API slash to-dos. So I believe that's correct. So first thing first, let's do a GET request to get all the data that we have in the backend. Just gonna use state and use effect. Okay, I have my to-dos over here to basically just store the current data that I have right there. And then, yep, I do a fetch request. I serialize the JSON because it's a string at first. It will become an object. And then when that finishes, this one will become an array. I just set that towards the value of this one. Okay. So now let's just do a console log of that one, and let's take a look. That is extremely strange. Let's just Any ideas what's causing the problem? Is it saying say failed fetch? Let's just do a console log of this one. See what's up. Maybe I made a mistake somewhere there. That one's fine. It could also be because of course. Hang on a sec. So while we're in the topic of course, so course is a very common issues when you do the MVVM architecture integration. Course stands for cross-origin resource sharing. It's basically a protection mechanism for a backend and also front end, so that you don't get data from a server that does not actually permit it. To solve that in terms of Django, I have to install this, and then I basically have to allow. I basically just have to add this couple things. So just to reiterate, CORS is a configuration in the backend, but it's usually a problem that you will encounter when you're in the front end. Okay? So just some Django specific things. I'm just adding CORS headers over to my installed apps, and then I'm just adding a couple of middlewares. As high as possible. Okay, hopefully that just works. Still a problem, but looks like still that problem over there. One sec. I think I just forgot one thing over here. I'm just gonna say localhost 3000 is one of the allowed origins. Okay. As you can see, I am getting the data over here now. So we went from something that we didn't really know what's happening. It just said failed to fetch, and we looked at the console. We saw that it's a course error. We fixed the course error in the backend, and now we have the data over here. Okay. Now, by doing that, let's take a look at now dynamically creating our interface using what's written in terms of the backend. Okay. First and foremost, I just want a div over there. I do have an ID, I have a title, and I do have a description. Okay, let's render that. So as you can see over here, we have our interface dynamically responding towards anything that's in the backend. So let's go further to that idea. Let's just compare. As you can see here, the title, we have the description, completed, and also created that. Currently, I'm not doing a lot of stylings, so I'll just put the details over here, like for example, the completed. Right over there. Take a look. And I'm pretty sure I have to cast this into a string. And the easiest way to cast that is using this. One sec. Okay, looks like there's a toString method. So I just do toString right there. Okay, right there. And then next one is the created at. Right over here, created that. There's probably going to be some error, but let's take a look. If not, we're good to go. Okay. We're good to go over here. Now that we've done this one, we did one of the operation, which is just a get request. Now let's take a look at trying to add a post request. So adding a post request, So first and foremost, we probably need to have another div over here, and say something like it's a form, maybe. I have an input type text. Hang on a sec. There we go. I would say it's a name of the title. And this one is description. And then I have a submit button over here. And then I say on submit here. And then I have a handle submit here. So this is the function that will get executed on here. You probably want what's called a handle change event. And then we're going to need some sort of some way to track the state of our form. We have a title, which is initialized on empty. We have a description, like that. Now let's just bind our inputs over towards that. Say handle on change. I say handle change over here. This one will have an event, and I can say the name and its value, and I set my form over to that value. I just do a console log over here so that we can check that our input binding to the form is working. Value is equal towards the, this one is mistake, this one is form dot, first is the title, next one is the description. Okay, this one will be our handle submit. Currently it does not have anything, so let's take a look. Okay, I have two things over here. I have the title right here, I have my description right here. Okay, looks like that one is working. Now when we do a handle submit, we have to do a fetch or a post request. We do have that one, our method as a post. We have a header as an application JSON. This one, we're trying to convert our object into a JSON string format and then sending it towards the backend. We take a look at the response, because if we take a look at this again, just testing it over here. When we do a post request, we actually get a response back right over here. We also, the most important one here is the ID, and that means that if we have an ID over there, we can basically update our current state right here without doing another GET request by adding the new to-do that we just created right over here to the existing one. Okay, and let's just do that over here again. Let's refresh this page. So currently we have 3 of them. I just add more things over here and I submit. So as you can see here, we have a 4th entry over here, and my page didn't even reset. Actually, sorry about this one. It did reset because I forgot to put what's called event prevent default over here. You have to do this whenever you're handling forms that's doing on submit. Otherwise, it's going to do a refresh. Alright, let's just do this one and submit. As you can see here, it's like almost instantaneous. It just updates our interface. Let's take this a little bit more. Now, we want to have the ability maybe to actually update a specific to-do or even delete it. And then we're done for the demo. So firstly, let's just remove a little bit of the console log so that it's cleaner. Okay. Let's add a new button over here. Maybe it's like, actually maybe it's just easier to demonstrate a delete, because if I do a update, then I have to do another form. But that's fine for the delete. So let's create a new button here. Just a usual button. And I want to say on click. Over here, I do a handle delete. But there's probably much more on this one. I say a handle delete on what ID. This one, I'll create a function over here to run handle delete, and I will say to do.id right here. Then now I can create a new function here. It's called handle delete. It takes an ID, and then it does a fetch or a delete request. Take a look at this one, the URL over here /id. I said a method delete, and like that. I think I will get a response back, but let's take a look. If I go towards /1, I do a delete. I basically have what's called an HTTP 204, no content. It means that it basically got accepted if it's a 204, because that means success. Then using this one will not have any response, but this is what we can do. Our new to do, or at least the state, we have to filter it so to remove the to do that we actually remove. So we're removing things. We're only keeping things that are not equal towards what we're deleting. Okay? Now that we have that, let's take a look. Right over here. We did not put anything over here. Delete. Okay. Click this. Click another thing. Click this. Looks like I have some syntax error over here. Let's take a look. Handle delete. I don't actually see where the error is. Let's take a look at what's the network request. Actually it's fine for the most part. Let's delete this one again. Take a look. It does a request to delete it. That's extreme. I have an idea why. It's this one. Right here. Let's take a look. And then, there we go. We have our delete operation. So now we've done get request on the listing. We did the post request, and we did a delete on the REST API endpoint. So I think that finishes the demo over here. I'm sure you can think about how to make this even more better. Like for example, the stylings, maybe even having some form of way to actually do more information about a specific thing. Maybe you want to integrate some way to actually get specific information about it to do. Maybe it's not just these 3 fields. Maybe there's more. Okay? So does anybody have any questions? I think just to say something, as you can see over here, this handling operation, this is not specific to React. You can probably use that in Vue as well. The only thing that will change is how you have that particular function binded towards your user interface. This one will remain the same, kind of. Handle submit, and probably handle change as well. Actually, not handle change. So it's really this one. Okay. So I guess that's the end of the first workshop.